Okay, welcome back to Summer of Drawing. And so today what we're going to be talking about, and you can use any drawing media, are folds and animals. And that probably seems like kind of an odd combination of topics to put together. But I have my reasons, as you'll see when we go into this. I'm going to go ahead and screen share so we can get started. We'll be covering a lot of information today and doing a small amount of drawing and then much more drawing next week, because I want to introduce quite a number of concepts that I'd like you to employ. So, just sit back and sort of take in the information. If you need to watch the video again afterwards, that might be useful. But as you've probably noticed with a lot of what we've been doing this summer, I'm introducing you to new drawing media, and we're talking about different techniques and such. But what I'm really trying to do is get you to see more. And I'm sure by now, you're seeing contrast in things, you're seeing value relationships, your ability to assess proportions and angles and all of that has improved. And that is really the most important thing, whether or not you've had a lot of time to draw in any of the drawing media. Or can encounter any of the subjects that we're even talking about. What's really important is being able to see more clearly, because that way, anytime you pick up a pencil to doodle or whatever, you're going to hold yourself to a higher degree of excellence. And that's what I'm really after for you, is not perfection, perfection of colored pencils or perfection of anything, but it is to keep pushing yourself towards excellence by learning and taking in new information and then trying to apply it when and where you can. We have a tendency to think artists whose work we see that is really amazing, oh, I'll never be able to do that. Why should I even bother? And to a certain extent, yeah, you won't be able to do exactly that because that's that person. But that person got there by pursuing step after step after step their own ability to improve until they got to this level of excellence. So I think I can see it for all of you, and I'm going to continue to encourage it. All right, so let me go ahead and share the screen. All right, class number 17. Wow, all media, folds, and animals. So I'm going to just double back to colored pencil for a couple of seconds because it actually applies to today. So we were talking about layering and all the colors and color mixing and this, that, and the other. And one of the, I couldn't cover everything in the world of colored pencil in 2 classes, but I wanted to point out something very interesting. There are some styles which are very approachable for people who are starting to do colored pencil, such as this one. Louis Ferreira does, he's a painter as well, but he does a lot of artwork where he is concentrating not so much, he's layering his colors and this, that, and the other, and he's paying attention to his colors. You can see that in particular in the inside around the eyes. But what he's doing is he's following the planes of the face. And that is super important and has a lot to do with what we're going to be talking about today. And here's another guy, John Smolko. Now he's another one. Yeah, sure, he's interested in layering, but look at all that cross-hatching, hatching. Paying attention to the form, the light and the dark, but also, whoa, is that his own personal statement or what? Fabulous, fabulous stuff. And I hope you'll go and look up some of these people's work and see what they're doing. Each one of them, just started liking something that they were doing and started doing more of it and built on that, improving their work until they got to this sort of point. This is a Korean artist, once again, using colored pencil and paying attention to the planes of the feet. So we're going to be talking a lot about that today. But rather than smoothing everything out, everything doesn't have to be smooth and photographic, and yet still has this amazing sense of realism and depth. And lastly, I want to show you Per Adolfsson's work. He's a Danish artist, and he does a lot. In fact, I think most of his work is graphite and colored pencil together. And he is really very graphic and very sketchy and hatching and this, that, and the other. And if you're finding yourself having difficulty, figuring out how you're going to do, depth and atmosphere and all of that kind of stuff, have a look at Per Adolfsson's work and see how he has tackled, look at his sky, right? It's very much, it's very graphic. It's just like the little shapes is, very Van Gogh, very, who else would I say it was like? Well, it's a very contemporary sort of look. We're not so much worrying about distance, but it carries itself off from a design point of view really nicely. And it's a wonderful way to use colored pencil. So I just wanted to introduce all of that to you because we ourselves are going to be talking about planes today. And this is what sort of unites folds and animals. People get very, just like when we've been talking about, drawing the face, drawing the body, this, that, and the other. When you start talking about folds, people start to freak out because folds look complicated. And likewise, there are a lot of really, people have attempted to draw animals and it hasn't quite succeeded. Let's put it that way. And part of that is because we get ourselves very concerned about fur, fur. And the fluffier the fur is, the worse things get. And it's just like with drawing faces, we get ourselves all worried about the fact it's a face rather than just breaking things down into shapes and light and dark. So what is a plane? So a plane on a cube is very easy to see. Those are the sides as the light falls on the object of the cube. The different planes, the different surfaces, receive a different amount of light, or light bounces off, the surrounding areas in different ways, so that we can see a shift in value. So, we've been talking about value all summer, and value is a result of light either being able to get to the subject or not get to the subject, and to get to the subject on different planes, so that on one side, the planes on one side of an object are getting light, so they're lighter, on the other are not, or else are receiving reflected light, just like we were talking about with the lemon and the apple and peppers and all of that stuff. So light bouncing around reflects off the object, but the way that we see value is based on where the light is getting to on that object, how much light is hitting it. It creates in our eyes, a value that's different from the area that's getting more light and different from the area that's getting more dark. And when we as artists represent that on paper, we can make something look three-dimensional. This applies to folds and this applies to animals. So here we've got, okay, very basic, number of planes on a cube, more planes on this circular form, and then an even more geodesic sort of approach to breaking down a circle into even more planes. So when you're drawing and you're simplifying something to begin with, you want to break things down into the fewest number of planes you can get away with on a particular surface. And then as you get more and more involved, you'll use more of a breakdown and you'll get more detail. So I'm just going to flip back for a minute to looking right here at what Louis was up to. So he has broken things down into a number of planes. He's found a number of different planes on the face to identify, each one with different colors and different strokes. Then you look at Gim's work, and he has gone even further, and he's sort of subdividing certain areas into lights and darks. He's looking a little bit further. So we're going to start off with a more simple version. But I did also want to show you how, the planes of the head, we talked before about anatomy and how to view things that we draw in terms of light and dark and the different values, and how things look differently depending on how light is shining. So if you look at a breakdown like this over on the left, all the different ways a face can look depending on how light hits the various planes of the face, a plane being under the cheeks, another plane being the center of the forehead, the sides of the forehead, the front of the nose. And then when we look over here at this fellow and we see how the light hits him, things are more rounded than they are in this sculptural form over to the left. But we can still identify those planes, right? We can see the center of the forehead versus the side of the forehead. We can see how the top of the head is not, it's not flat. Those aren't big flat areas. There are multiple facets, like a gemstone that's cut. That is how everything in the world can be broken down. And this helps us a lot when it comes to doing artwork, because those areas where we see a plane change, for example, from the top of the cheekbone to the sides of the cheek, that getting that area right where that plane change happens, that is what helps make our artwork look so much better. So even though we're not actually doing people today, I wanted to show this to you, because now this model over here on the left, those planes have been broken down even further into the very, very small changes that you see around a person's face. But you can see when you look at these photos over to the left, how that applies, how when light is hitting a person's face, what it is doing is hitting various planes. These are sort of, when you see a sculptor add clay onto a model they're making, and they're doing it a bit at a time. They're adding planes onto some basic armature to create these things which actually are our faces. So let's go to something a lot more simple, and that is talking about folds. So folds can be very confusing to people because when you're looking at clothing and when people are drawing it, particularly if they've done life drawing and they haven't really done a lot that is involved actually adding clothes to people, it's hard to know what to do with the various different sort of folds and forms you're seeing. So this week, I'm not going to get really technical about the names and all the types of folds and such. I just want to talk about the basics. And the basics are how fabric falls and folds is affected by two things: gravity and obstructions. So what a piece of fabric is trying to do is fall on the floor and lay flat. That is what it's after. That's what gravity is telling it to do. It's telling it, go down there and lay flat. And so everything that we see, here's my dress, it's on me. I'm the obstruction. I'm stopping it from doing that. When I have folds under my sleeve, it's because that fabric has been caught up. It is not allowed to even drape. It's not even allowed to, to hang down towards the floor. So the simplest kind of fold is this sort of fold, a very simple fold over one obstruction. Nothing's getting in the way. So you can see there's a little bit of a plane change. And you can see that because it goes from light to dark. So, along the top where the light is hitting it is one plane. And actually it's probably several planes if we really analyze it. But for the moment, we're just going to say what we see is we see one plane, and then we see a plane change as the towel falls down. Now we've got a couple of other really subtle plane changes going on there too. There's a teeny tiny wrinkle that the product photographer didn't get out of there before they shot this. And so, you could say, well, there are some subtle plane changes in there as well. But really what you're talking about is light is hitting the top, and then it can't get to the sides quite as well. And that's why we see that the change in the value. And then the other thing that has an effect on how we see folds is the source of light. So in this particular case, the shadows also come into play. So we've got plane changes that happen because fabric's just trying to head to the ground, and then we've got because of the light shining, we've got shadows that occur in different places. So these are the two things that interplay with each other to create the complexity of folds. But I wanted to start by showing you this very simple version. Now here's one that's a little more complex. So this is what they call like a 1-point fold. Things are, once again, the fabric is trying to head to the ground. Gravity is in control, but something is stopping it at one point. And so the fabric hangs, based on how that 1 point is situated. So it could be a peg, it could be, like this, a little hook or something. So in this particular case, you can see a little bit more clearly, gravity is pulling the whole thing down. There really aren't any obstructions except for the fact that it's being held at this one particular point. How it looks to us, though, is affected definitely by the source of light. So we've got a couple of things going on, and I did this quick sketch just to sort of show you. When we look at something like this, which is pretty, starting to get kind of complex, the first thing we have to look at is go, okay, where's my source of light? So that's coming from over here on the left. I can tell that because some stuff is, up in front that's lit, and then behind it we see things in shadow. So that kind of tells us where the source of light is coming from. And then we've got this thing about gravity, which is creating these folds in the cloth. And within those folds where the light can't get to, it's very dark. And where the folds are very gentle, we see subtle plane changes. If we were going to do those like those head mannequins, you'd have a flat form, then a flat form, then a flat form, sort of going around, right? Going around this subtle curve, and then it abruptly starts again, and it comes around the next fold because of the very deep ins and outs that are created by this whole piece of fabric trying to follow gravity all the way on down. So a lot of dealing with folds and trying to understand how to draw them is understanding what we're actually looking at. Source of light, gravity, and then any obstruction that might be in the way. So here we go again. In this particular case, you know, I think you're starting to get the hang of it. The light is coming in from over on the left. We can tell that because we can see that the left-hand side of all of those bumps have light and the right-hand side has less. Now, here's where things start to get confusing when it comes to folds. And this is the stuff I want you to start really looking for this week. You know, everywhere that you look, you know, paper towels, cloth, what you're wearing, what the other person is wearing, is this business of, if you look at these particular folds, the one that's kind of lit the most in the middle, you can see on the right-hand side, that is also a little bit light. Not only the left-hand side is light, but the right-hand side is a little bit of light too. And that is reflected light that's coming from somewhere else. So it can be a number of things. In this particular case, I don't know whether the photographer is bouncing the light off a, you know, one of those big white round things to get some light back, or whether that's just natural ambient light. But what happens is things start to get confusing to people when they can't see that there's only one light coming from one source, like we can see over on the fold on the left-hand side. You know, light on one side, dark on the other, easy. Things start getting complicated when we start seeing this other bit of light come in there. And so knowing how it got there, knowing that that is light that's bouncing around from somewhere and coming back, less intense, but still able to be seen. Once you start noticing that and seeing how it goes, also, if you squint, you see it's not as bright as the more direct light that's falling on this object. Being able to draw the various values you see here, you know, maybe one side is just the paper, and the other side, you've got a tiny, tiny bit of shading. That starts to give the form of what's going on. But I must say that there aren't, like, it's not like a formula, right? Because one fold is different from the other fold, and yet they're both on the same object. However, getting an interesting drawing, rather than just making it look like a shower curtain, basically, that's everything's exactly the same, depends on us observing that, observing what's going on, realizing that first fold is deep enough that there wasn't much reflected light going on, but somehow the second one has some. Likewise, looking at how the shadows kind of, you know, from one fold creates a shadow on the next bit of towel that comes up. So as we see on the far right in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little bit of a shadow that's cast because the bigger fold blocks the light from getting all the way over to that edge. So this is all, you know, isn't it all the same kind of stuff we've been talking about all summer, but now we're just applying it to cloth. So I used towels for these examples because the softer the fabric, the easier it is to see and draw folds to start off with. If you draw a piece of silk or something very fine, you'll get more folds and things become more complicated. So it's a lot easier, for example, to, you know, throw a sweatshirt over a chair and try drawing that, something that has some bulk to it, or a towel, because it's easier to find, and those changes in planes are a lot softer. So here we go again, okay? I keep repeating this information, you know, for a reason, because I'm trying to get this point. Fabric wants to fall on the floor. And when it does fall on the floor, it's trying to flatten out, but sometimes it can't. And sometimes the obstruction is itself. So if you think, for example, of a woman's beautiful long ball gown or wedding dress, it gets to the floor and then it spreads out. And that is what is happening in this particular example here, because it has reached a point where it can't go any further. It can't go into the ground. It has to move outwards. But perhaps there is something, whether the weight of its own fabric or some other object or a piece of fabric folded over itself, that is causing an obstruction. And so at this point, though, the fabric is trying to head outwards because it's trying to move away. You know, it's trying to find flatness. And understanding and being able to look for this is really key to making your folds look real, because you want, when they're on an object or on a person, you want that downward feeling as gravity pulls down. And when the fabric hits the floor, you want that outward feeling of that fabric trying to flatten out, but not being able to. And in this particular case, you can see just a little bit along the front here, how you can see a little bit of the fact of the floor. Right through the fabric. You can see places where it sort of goes flat and then it goes up to the curve where the fabric itself is sort of folded up on itself and has created an obstruction. And you can see even more in this particular case where once again, it's trying to flatten out, but it can't because these boxes are underneath there. And you can see the form of the boxes created by the way the fabric falls down. So why this is so important is because if you can figure out how to draw by using plane changes and by using the correct values, those areas where fabric does change planes and go over something, if you put those edges, those changing planes in the right place, you create the feeling of a form underneath the fabric. In a very realistic looking way. And that is when people draw fabric on a person, when they draw clothing on a person, if they are able to create that sense of a form underneath, a person underneath, an arm within that piece of fabric, that's when it really starts to work. When it doesn't work is when it's just a bunch of scribbly lines indicating, folding cloth. And it almost looks like the arm must be flat because there isn't a sense of form underneath. This is where observation really comes into play. So this is the kind of stuff that drives people crazy. This is a drop cloth I had. This is actually for a painting I'm working on, but I had thrown a drop cloth over a sofa. And this is the stuff that makes people's minds fuse when they think about folds. It's like, what the heck? So Mike Hernandez is an artist who's been teaching a digital and gouache class. And I sat in on the class. I was very curious to know what his teaching approach was. Really interesting fellow. And he works in he used to work in like concept art, video games, that kind of thing. And he's just really super. But I just love in the middle of the class, he said this the other day, and I said, this is a quotable quote. If you don't know what to do with it, get rid of it. If it seems obvious, keep it. And I couldn't think of any better way to apply that than to folds, because your eyes are they're taking in all this information, fold, what's going on? And that's this. And then people just start drawing a bunch of lines, right, to represent folds, sort of generic symbols for folds. And that's when it all falls apart. So this is not an actual drawing. This is just a photograph that I'm going to be using for some reference. And believe me, I'm going to be simplifying this quite a bit. So if I'm looking at this, the first thing I'm going to do is that same idea of the notan. Like I might not necessarily do a rectangle, but I am definitely going to squint at this and go, okay, what is the most obvious? Where are the most obvious folds? Where are the most obvious plane changes going on? And so the most obvious plane changes are where I can see the form of the sofa, basically. And so I'm going to want to keep that, right? I want this to look like fabric over a sofa. I want people to know that's under there. So, I mean, this is very difficult. This is not what I want you to start off doing, but I do want you to sort of see how you might approach that. Where are the biggest and easiest, most obvious to see folds? Put those in. The other ones that look complicated, that you're not quite sure, do you even need them? You probably don't. Just leave them out. So take that approach, especially when you start dealing with folds, because if you don't, it'll drive you insane, and it'll make it difficult for you to draw and paint people or animals or anything else, because this sort of concept of complexity and plane changes and stuff appears on everything, and we have to be able to at some point to edit for ourselves, edit down what we see, so that we can get to the core of what was interesting. So for me, what's interesting about this is the way the light hits this, and the kind of, I love that feeling of the gravity, pulling kind of like a waterfall, almost like a waterfall of fabric coming over the top of the sofa. So that idea is what I would be wanting to keep in mind. So let me just move on, get away from this really complicated looking thing and go to something simple. So back to plane changes. So these are folds also. A fold doesn't have to be rounded like a towel. It can be a sharp fold like on a paper airplane. So everywhere you look around you and you see plane changes, and it could be like, I'm looking out here at my deck and I can see the railing does, it goes flat and then it goes down to the side. That's a plane change. So I hadn't really meant it to be a pun on planes, as in like planes, but here we are. Maybe that'll help everyone remember it. So I wanted to point out this one when it comes to complicated stuff, because people always look at this and go, oh my gosh, this is how you're supposed to draw folds. I'll never be able to do it. So therefore I'm giving up. And I'm just putting little lines in. But I wanted to tell you a couple of things. One is I thought this was fascinating to find out that he took a piece of fabric and he actually saturated it with mud and then arranged it over a form, a mannequin or a clay model, I'm not quite sure which, and very, very carefully arranged all of this, and then drew it or painted it in gray tempera with a little bit of white on a grade prepared linen canvas. So this has been reproduced many, many times. People draw it in on toned paper with charcoal and white, because you can paint it, you can do whatever, because it's a wonderful study. There's no doubt about it. I'm not taking anything away from Leonardo, but at the same time, looking at folds like this isn't always what just sort of happens out there in nature. It's a wonderful study, and it's a wonderful way to look at the light and all the various different ways the folds work. But doesn't it just work the way we've been talking about? Gravity is trying to pull the fabric down. There are obstructions, and those obstructions are folds that have been created, or the body underneath, or the fact that when it gets to the floor, it can't go as far as it wants because it's kind of locked up on itself in various different places because of the way the fabric is falling. So one really good way to practice doing drawing folds is to look at statuary, because a sculptor has already simplified to a certain extent what is going on, and it's color and pattern and such are taken out of the way. So I've got right here, you can probably see me in the little window up here, I've got like a patterned tea towel and I'm holding up. And so, on one hand, you can see folds and this, that, and the other, but it's very difficult to not also look at all that pattern and wonder what to do with it. When you're starting off, you can always, flip the fabric the other way up, and then it's easier to see what's going on. But it is a lot easier to look at very simple forms, or fabric that's only one color. Or if you're getting somebody to sit for you so you can sketch them, have them put a simple top on, not a checkered top or something like that. So once again, you get, in this particular case, the light is kind of diffused, but you can still see it's coming in from the left. It's creating these shadows. Light can't get to certain places. There are plane changes going on, which make the values of light and dark change quite a bit. And this is our first drawing exercise. So what I'd like you to do is draw some section, or maybe even all of this person's body. I left everything else off here because I just want you to concentrate on this middle bit. And I'd like you to sort of break down, first just, sketch out these proportions as correctly as you can. And then have a look at where the light and the dark is. And even if you're just drawing, flat planes, as we saw earlier, either in my little towel sketch or what we saw with the face plane changes, just sort of draw to the extent you can where you see plane changes happening and where you see light and dark occurring. Where there's a little bit of reflected light, that is a plane change that means the form has turned around to a point where it can catch some light somehow that was being hidden. So in this particular case, let's see how long, let's take about 5 minutes, let's take a little longer than, a little more than 5 minutes, just to get a basic sketch of this worked out. And maybe you just want to concentrate on the sleeve or something. You don't have to do all of this person. But the idea is just to have a good look at some of these shadows and folds and see how they got there. So very, very simple folds at the front, right? Piece of fabric, it's trapped by the belt, and it's just heading down towards the ground. Because of the source of light coming from the right, you can see there's a shadow that's cast. All right, so that's nice and simple. And then as you move around her hips, you're just really dealing with plane changes. And then as the fabric gets below her hips, it's freer to move. It's not obstructed by the body because the legs come inwards. And so the fabric itself starts to fall more like a shower curtain. And there's sort of a regularity to it. And you can see how as the fabric turns away from the light, the plane change causes it to be hidden. So therefore, you've got a darker value. And then in some cases, there's a little reflected light from the next fall of fabric, where on one side, it's picking up a lot of light. Some of that light is bouncing back onto the previous fold. And then you continue around the body. That part of the body is more blocked by the light. But then as you go around to the back, there's a secondary, less strong light source coming from the left that's causing a little bit of that extra lighting there. So this particular image is one that I think would be really useful for you to come back and draw. I would also suggest drawing the towels, because those are super simple. Those are some of the very basic folds, you know, just over one item, a 1-point fold heading towards gravity, and then a fold where everything is kind of bunched up. And you know, as we go on next week, we'll get into some of the more elaborate types of folds, like we saw on Leonardo's piece. But this is, I think, a good way to start. Now, what's happening as you go over there to the arm that we see on the left-hand side is you're starting to see that business of fabric is being trapped. It's and they call this, I believe that these are locking folds is how people refer to this. And that is basically the fabric is not free for one reason or another. In this particular case, in part because of the way it's sewn, also because it's sort of trapped by the arm, trapped by the belt. And that creates these little sort of hidden caves of fabric. And in there, light bounces around and they're almost like little sub-caves of fabric. It takes a little while to get used to looking at that. And so to start with, this is where I say to squint. And let's follow Mike Hernandez's advice about if we're not quite sure what to do with something, just leave it out. And yet, if you can really see it, like you can see some of those darker folds much more clearly, go ahead and leave those in. So I'll just a few more minutes to draw on this, and then we'll move on to the next bit. I just read the question in chat. How many hours do we have to draw this? Tell me about it. I've actually been working on, you know, the colored pencil squash from last week that I showed you that I did really quickly. Part of the problem with preparing for these classes is I usually like to take a long time in my own personal drawing, you know, to enjoy myself and have music playing or a book on tape. And you know, I don't usually draw in 15-minute intervals, and it's to try to do something like that and squeeze it in for the class is difficult. So I started on this squash, and it's still ongoing. So that's just a squash. Never mind all of those folds on the fabric. But I do want to mention that. I mention that a lot. I know that, you know, the quick sketches I'm showing you are really quick sketches, and that, you know, to do some of these fantastic pieces of work that we see does take a while. But that's the fun of art as well. So you know, this is sort of the, you know, you're at the party and someone's coming around with a plate of hors d'oeuvres. And if you're lucky, you get, you know, to take one before she zings off with the plate to somebody else. And this is kind of what we're doing here. Okay, everybody, wrap this one up and let's move on. All right, so animals. So I thought a really fun way to kind of, you know, we talked about planes before, and I showed you the paper airplane, was origami, because origami, when it comes to animals, is a great way to start thinking about any kind of animal at all, whether you're trying to draw a horse or a dog or a cat. And I'm concentrating kind of on dogs and cats right now, just because, you know, they're around, we can see what's going on. So like I mentioned before, you know, if you've got a very fluffy pet, a golden retriever, or, you know, my cat is a a medium long hair. It's not easy. It's not easy because all of that, that fluff distracts us. And the next thing you're in there trying to draw hairs and stuff, and the form underneath has been completely lost. So looking at, an origami piece like this kind of reminds you that planes occur on everything, even on stuff that's fluffy. There's an underlying structure there of light and dark. And one thing that I've mentioned this before when it comes to, taking your own pictures to draw from, or selecting ones to draw from, or setting up a still life or where a person's going to sit or anything. Make it easy on yourself and have some lighting coming in from a direction, and have some shadow available, and maybe even a second, less intense light somewhere, so that you create this sense of form. So whoever photographed this origami also did us a favor by lighting it in such a way that we can see how the form works. When you're trying to take a picture of a dog or a cat, and they're completely lit, the camera flattens out the images, and also the lighting, if it wasn't directional like that, doesn't really give us any sense of form unless we are really conversant with the anatomy of that particular animal. We're off to a difficult start. So here, for example, I thought this was really good, and this also applies to things without fur. So, if a stegosaurus is wandering through your neighborhood and you'd like to draw it, well, a good thing to think about is this piece of origami down here, where this object, although it's got all of this roundedness to it, really, when you think of what's happening, how light is hitting the object, how one part of the object is hiding the light from another, which creates, as those planes are changing, creates light, then dark, then medium, then highlight again, then darker, and then super dark where the light really can't get to it. Thinking in terms of subdividing even a rounded looking object into planes does make it a lot easier to figure out how to start drawing it. In this particular case, if you look at the Stegosaurus's tail, you can really see those plane changes, highlight, then down to the side, not so bright because there's not so much light, then highlight again, and then it disappears away from the light. And now what we were dealing with at the most is reflected light from the ground coming up. So any animal can be drawn this way. And I just wanted to show you these pieces by Joseph Wu, who's just an amazing origami artist. But once again, breaking down even like the complexity of a horse, for example, or a sheep and all of that fur, breaking it down into the idea of plane changes and how that might affect overall. So next week, I'm going to talk about how we add the texture to all of that, the fur and the hair and this, that, and the other. But if we don't have the underlying structure of the animal correct, it becomes very difficult. All the fluff in the world is not going to fix that. So we want to really be able to see those lights and darks and see how that happens. By the way, just talking about horses for a second, there's a friend of mine who does logging with his wonderful Belgian horse out in the western part of Michigan. And he is going to do a talk and a drawing series with me through, I think we'll just do 2 sessions through the Vineyard Haven Public Library this fall or winter, where we'll be doing drawing horses, and he's going to talk a little bit about how he does this logging with his horse Hazel. So I'll give you more information about that as we firm up those plans. But I mention that because it will be an opportunity to draw one of the more complex animals, which is a horse. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at animals from this point of view of plane changes. And you can see here, this is a little sculpture. Actually, there are a number of sculptors who actually sell small models so that sculptors and artists can actually practice drawing from them or creating from them to understand how plane changes work. Because a sculptor has to create something that's going to work and look interesting in 3 dimensions. We're more interested in converting that 3-dimensional image into something that's on 2 dimensions. But you can see here, for example, that a lion has a lot of roundedness to him in reality. He's got a fluffy mane, there's fur, there's muscle, this, that, and the other. But you can see that for a sculptor in particular, to make an effective sculpture, it is very useful to break down the form to be slightly more realistic than what we see up here on the left, but still it captures the light, doesn't it? And it creates a sense of three-dimension and of presence. It creates a sense of light and dark that's very dramatic. So taking the same point of view and looking at animals from that same sort of aspect. Let's see, this is what we're going to spend some time drawing. Now, I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to work on this, which is like a luxury, I know, in terms of class. But there are a number of reasons I'd like to do that. So just pick anything. You can try to draw 3 of these ladies. You can try to just draw 1 or a head. And I've left this one sculptor's model of a plaster cast of a head up here, sort of to give you some ideas of what to look for. Now, obviously, once you've added muscle and tendons and fat and fur and everything else, on top of those, that basic, that form, that skeleton, it becomes a little more difficult to see the plane changes. So I'd like you to take a little bit of time before you get started drawing and just have a look at these heads. Just pick one of them perhaps to study, and have using this this model over here on the left as sort of as reference. Have a look for how that works once you've got a little bit more fur on there. And as you draw, see if you can at least highlight how those plane changes work. So I'm going to just sort of talk about the lion who's over on the right, and how, if you look under her eye, the eye on the far right, you can see that, right below the eyeball, there's sort of a little bit of a shelf that goes out. And not only is the light catching it, but also she's got pale fur right there. Then there's rather an acute plane change that heads downwards, but it doesn't go straight down. It then kind of curves. You can see how it gets a little bit darker, right? And it goes inwards. And then what happens, which is sort of, this is where the fur and everything else comes in. She's got extra fur and she's got extra skin that is sort of hanging right here. Like if she were to open her mouth, that would stretch really tight. And so there's a little bit of a plane change where you see kind of a ridge right there that makes that paleness. That's a combination of fur and also of light catching that. So that's another little area where there are, if we were to draw that in detail, there are actually probably, 4 or 5 different planes going around there, but we don't have to be that exact. What we have to realize is that the actual shape of the head is moving that way. So if you're hatching today with your pencil or whatever it is that you're using, I would try doing that sort of method that we saw the artist Louis at the beginning of the slideshow, where he was using colored pencil and just doing hatching to follow the form of a human face. I would try doing that on the lion and just sort of see if you can get some plane changes. And as you find ones that are darker, do more closer together hatching or darker hatching, and then fade it away for light. So what we're doing here is we're doing a number of things. We're trying to find the structure of the animal. We're trying to look at how plane changes work, even though we're dealing with a photograph that's kind of flattened things out a bit. We're using this reference over here on the left to sort of remind us how a head works. And then look for those plane changes happening on the body. So a person who is a wildlife artist and who is really good has taken some time to study the skeletal and muscular structures of the animals that they are drawing. Because really, just like on a human, it's so much easier to draw a face if you know what the skull looks like. It's easier if you touch your own face and you can feel that eyebrow ridge and you feel the nose and you feel your cheekbones, then regardless of how much fat there is or isn't in all of those places, you know that there's some underlying structure there that you're trying to key in on. It's a lot more difficult when it comes to an animal because, we don't really, at least I don't, have, lions running through my house to look at more closely to see what's going on. I just have a wee little lion and she's got a lot of fluff on her. So over the years, I have I've taken the time to look for, pictures of cat skeletons and this, that, and the other, to get a sense of how, especially those cheekbones work, because they're much more acute on a cat than one would think of. The hollowing out there is very much like on a human, where we've got this hollowing out, but there ends up being a fat pocket there and some skin and stuff sitting on top. So when we're drawing, we have to pay attention to that information that we know about. That's that knowledge we have in our heads, but we also have to look at what's actually in front of us, because what is actually in front of us is not a skeleton, but is an actual lion in the flesh with all of that muscle and fat and fur on top. So getting that sense of realism is in part paying attention to the value changes that you see of light and dark, but also understanding why they're happening. Sometimes they're happening because an animal is actually changing color. There's white fur, there's beige fur, there's brown fur. But sometimes it's because there are plane changes happening in addition. And getting that feeling of almost creating an origami lion will start to get you in the right direction. So, what happens next, right? You've got your basic form down, you've got your light and your dark. That is when you can start softening some of those edges. Everything doesn't have to be really angular, like over here on the left. That's when you can go, and if you feel like you're very confident, you can kind of shortcut and go, okay, I see how that plane change works, but I don't actually have to draw it in specifically. I'm just going to let my hatching go lighter, go darker, whatever it needs to. I'm going to follow the form, but I'm not necessarily going to draw all the ridges and stuff that might actually be there. And that's how you start creating this sense of 3-dimension in what you're drawing. Now, I'm going to give you a few minutes to work on this, and then I'm going to kind of talk about how if you're dealing with the rest of the body, how you would go on and do that. I'm losing my voice. I better take a sip of coffee. Okay, so if you're trying to draw a whole lion or even 3 whole lions, um, I think where people often find it difficult to start off with is this business of trying to understand the structure of an animal like a lion, and the amount of weight that's bearing down on the feet. The feeling of realism is created by a sense of this sort of musculature of an animal like a lion. And also the fact they're heavy, and those feet, those large feet, are holding all of this weight up. And getting that sense of weight and of stature depends on a couple of things. And the very first is making sure that those legs are drawn at the right angles, and making sure that the curves that you do see or the plane changes you do see are very strong and in the right place. Because if there's too much softening that goes on the legs, and this goes for dogs, for horses, for cats a little bit less, unless it's an animal that has like a tighter body, because often cats' legs, there's a lot of softness until you get down to the lower area near the paws. But in particular, when you can see a lot of the lower part of an animal, like on a bull, a horse, here on these lions, it's really, really important to get all of those changing directions of the bones and the muscles in the right place. And their legs are not like our legs, in the sense that where their particular bones turn and change direction is not the same as ours. Now we can't, next week I'm going to have to show you, my dad sent me a picture I did when I was about 3 of what I thought a horse looked like. Now I think I was trying to draw a mouse, but because I'm not sure how many, I don't know how many horses I'd seen at that point, but I know I'd heard an awful lot of Beatrix Potter. And so I think I was trying to draw a mouse. But basically what I had was a big lump with, with little pointy things that were legs and some sort of tail. So that is not obviously going to be a realistic animal. You can see here that there are, there's this curve that comes back out again in order to hold up that body. And on the back legs, it's difficult to see from this particular view, which is another reason why anyone drawing animals and wildlife, it's very good to see pictures from different directions if you haven't seen the animal in the wild. Because, if you just looked at this photo, you would think, oh, that's a really odd animal that's got like compressed legs that come right out of its back. And you wouldn't think about how long a lion really is and that we're looking at it foreshortened. But getting that sense of weight and getting those back hips in the right place, the back legs in the right place, and the sort of the curve that comes down of the forelegs will give you that feeling of structure. So that's once again when the good old pencil and checking your angles comes in. There is, especially when you're drawing something unfamiliar, like an animal like this, or any animal or person or object or situation that's not familiar, perhaps it's sailboats or a chair or whatever it happens to be. The way to make it look, you know now about value and shading and hatching and all of that kind of stuff. You know about notan. You now know about planes, but there's nothing that beats checking those angles after you've drawn them to make sure you've got them in the right place. Because I've seen quite a number of people draw animals and there isn't that sense of weight. And in part it's because the legs don't look quite like they would be bearing the stuff on top. So a lot of attention is paid to the head, but not so much is paid to the rest of the body, the bulk of the body, and making it look really three-dimensional. So when we're talking about plane changes on the body of an animal, we know that light's going to hit them on the top of the back, that there's going to be a spine, there's going to be a falling off, there's be like a first plane on the top that gets a little bit of light, and you can see it on both of these female lions right here, the right in the center. And then there's kind of an acute plane change that goes down at the sides like this, back by the hips. It goes actually under quite a bit, away from the light. So that creates that darkness. But further up towards the head, there's a rib cage underneath there. So the plane changes are not as acute until you get to a certain point where they go underneath and now the light can't get under there as well. And so that creates the darkness. So this is the business of understanding about plane changes, because it's not just a barrel. It's not just a big round form. If we were to look dead on at this lion, we wouldn't see a big round shape like a snowman. We would see this sort of like a more boxy shape. But what I don't do is I don't tell you, hey, to draw a line, draw a circle and then 2 more circles on the top and then make a box at the front. Because even though that's an interesting way to draw a lion out of your head, what I'm more interested in having you do is actually observe a real lion and figuring out how am I going to show that depth? How am I going to show the shape of the body? And the way to approach it to start with is this idea of looking at the planes, how the planes of the body move, and how that means that light can't hit them, and how when you then draw them in the correct value, you create the sense of that particular animal without having to draw any fur per se. Like I said, we'll get to the topic of fur next week, but I'm just going to start off by saying one of the things that I learned when I used to draw cars a lot. So I worked for a screen printer, and one of the things I loved doing was drawing antique cars. For some reason, we had a lot of orders for those. So I'd be drawing, 1950s vehicles and this, that, and the other. And the first thing I learned was you don't put detail everywhere. If you're going to put a little chrome on the bumper, like that feeling of detail, all that reflection in the chrome, you only need to do it in one place. You don't have to cover the whole car with it. And it helped give a sense of 3-dimension, because the bit that was more detailed looked like it came towards us and the rest sort of went away. So the same here on something like the lion. Even though we know there's fur there, really only where we see fur the most, where it's the most obvious, do we really need to put any kind of fluffy stuff. So there's a little bit underneath that ruff there. There's a little bit on the chest, a little bit, on the chin. And I would say that's kind of it. It may be up a little bit by the ears, depending on which one you're looking at. And that gives everybody the information that they need to know about lions. It gives them all the information to go with without having to sort of fluff her up completely and lose that whole sense of form. So starting with the idea that less is more is very useful when it comes to animals and fur of any sort. How much do you really need to put on there to show that this animal has some fluff? And if you start doing too much, are you going to lose this whole sense of structure completely? Okay, go ahead and wrap this up. And what we're going to do is, as I said, for next week, we're going to do go a little bit more complex, and we're going to handle dogs as our subject, and also have a look at horses, and deal with fabrics actually on people, and how you can use folds on fabrics on people to actually enhance a sense of action and motion or repose or whatever it is you're looking for. The folds and the fabric actually tell their own story when we're drawing. They're not just a nightmare that we have to figure out how to get ourselves through. But it's really important as you go around this week and start looking at anything, whether it's square, round, or whatever, look at it in terms of planes, how the light is falling on it, which plane is being hidden, which plane is being lit, and where there is reflected light from another surface bouncing back, giving kind of a secondary light side to an object. All right, let's move on here. Okay, so just to do a little bit of a wrap up here, drawing folds and animals, it's all about planes, as is everything else. So really there's not much you can't break down that way. Even if you're looking at, for example, trees, I'm looking out my window and I can see, bunches of trees. If I squint and look at that, there are, trees, leaves are like little solar panels, right? They want to get that sun. So there are planes of groupings of leaves. There's a top plane, there's a plane underneath, there's some falling out on the sides where, there are certain leaves that aren't going out as far as others. If I look at the trunk of the tree, there are planes as they go around like this in a cylindrical form, some that are catching more light, some that are not. If I can start to see that, I don't have to draw it like that. I don't have to draw it looking like the sides of a pencil, but it gives me an understanding of how to break things down. And you'll see in particular with painting, there are a lot of artists that don't really smooth out a lot of those plane changes. They actually leave them pretty acute. And starting to look for that will give you an appreciation of how those particular painters go about doing things. Or artists like we saw today in those early examples, where they decided to actually capitalize on that whole idea of plane change to make really interesting forms. So observation and practice is the key to mastery. I'm saying this all the time, but this is so true when it comes to these ideas, this idea of how light falls, where light isn't falling, and why. So when you look at folds, if you can this week, what I'd love you to do is either look at those photos we looked at, of the kimono or the towels, or just set something up for yourself. Before you start drawing, have a look at it and go, what is going on here? Where's my light source? Why are the shadows falling the way they do? Do I have any deep shadows that don't have any reflection in them? And do I have some that have some reflected light? Make a note of that so you can make sure they look a little bit different. And the way to draw this is to use your different values, the super darks, the middle, the pale, the highlight that maybe is just the paper color, and to try to modulate. Use that pencil by holding it near the back, not up here, near the front, to help you get that tonal range that you're after, to get the softness that you're after. And then how am I going to approach this, drawing this? Am I going to draw the whole thing? I'm going to pick just a little section. Do a little notan if you want to start off with, just to say, hey, this is the interesting design I'm going to do. Because even if I'm going to practice drawing a sweatshirt over the back of a chair or something, why not make an interesting little, composition out of this at the same time? Why not practice the whole thing? So our brain knows quite a bit, and I'm telling you this all the time as well, and it's happy to tell us all the time. So when it sees folds, like that complicated drape over the sofa, it's telling us, those are folds, look at all those folds. And it just, How do you do that? How do you take care of that? So you've got to be able to simplify, and to do that, we squint, we draw notans, we do value studies, which is sort of what these little sketches are with all the different planes and the different values. We're breaking it down, we're simplifying, we're taking away that information that we don't see. And once again, Mike's phrase, if you don't know what to do with it, get rid of it. I just love that. And if it seems obvious, keep it. And this is how, when you look at a wonderful piece of art, a drawing or a painting or sculpture or whatever, and they seem to have boiled something down to its essence, this is part of how they got there. It's just by not including the stuff that was going to get in the way. That really applies to folds. So we want to have our brains and eye working in coordination so that they understand the structure underneath. They understand, that there are planes to that lion's head, but they don't have to draw it all that way. They have to sort of step back at that point. The brain and the eyes have to step back and go, well, what am I actually seeing here? How is that actually working on this particular lion? Where is that? Where are the fat folds happening? How are the ears working? Is there fluff there or is there not? And all of that information together will help you start to break down how you're going to approach drawing the cat that's lying, on your floor, or your dog or whatever, by looking at it in terms of these plane changes and not worrying so much about surface texture, which we'll get to next week.